Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about the Great Tribulation, whether or not it's in our past or in our future. A lot of Christians say that the Great Tribulation is in our future. It has not happened yet. But is that really what the Bible teaches? I don't think so. And I think there's a lot of scriptural and historical evidence showing that the Great Tribulation did happen in the first century. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Okay, so my first point is this. Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse that the Great Tribulation would happen within his generation. Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse in around the year AD 30. So it was about a week before his crucifixion. In Mark 13's account of the Olivet Discourse, it begins in verse 1 with Jesus' disciples pointing out the temple stones, the beautiful temple, to which Jesus says in verse 2 that it would be destroyed. Not one stone would be left upon another, Jesus said. Now, you can imagine the astonishment when Jesus said this, because that temple had been standing for around 500 years, and it had just been completely refurbished by Herod the Great. The Jewish philosopher Philo said that this temple was so magnificent that it would last as long as the human race. So amidst this kind of thinking, Jesus said that it would be destroyed. Not one stone would be left upon another. Then in verse 4, the disciples asked when this event would happen. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are to be fulfilled? Jesus then mentions the various precursors like wars and rumors of wars, persecution, famine. And then in verse 19, Jesus mentions the Great Tribulation. He says, quote, "For in those days there will be tribulation such as not been since the beginning of creation which God created until this time. No shall ever be." Or no ever shall be, rather. So basically Jesus said it would be the greatest tribulation that ever was. Then after mentioning the Great Tribulation, Jesus said a few verses later that it would all happen within his generation. Here are Jesus' exact words. "Assuredly I say to you," and he's talking to his disciples, "this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." This is Mark 13, verse 30. So Jesus said all those things that he mentioned, including the destruction of the temple, famine, and the Great Tribulation, would all happen within his generation. This verse alone says it all. I mean, Jesus straight out says that it would happen within his generation, within this generation. Now, some people try to get around this timing indicator by claiming that Jesus was not really referring to the generation he was talking to, but rather to some farther off generation, thousands of years later. And it would be that generation that would see these things. But there's zero evidence for that view. Remember, Jesus is answering the question the disciples had just asked him, which was, when will the temple be destroyed? And Jesus doesn't just say these things will happen. He says, you will see this, and you will see that, and you will see this. He's clearly talking to the disciples, the people who asked the question. And he tells them, you will see these things. And then Jesus says it would all happen within this generation. In other words, it would all happen within Jesus' generation. It's so obvious to any unbiased reader what Jesus is referring to. He's referring to his contemporary generation, the people he was talking to. Keep in mind also that a biblical generation equates to about 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verse 8 to 10. Or Numbers 14, verse 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. So, since Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse in around the year AD 30, and Jesus said all these things would happen within a generation, or 40 years, then it must have all happened by the year AD 70. And that's exactly when it did happen. That all historians agree that that's when the temple was destroyed, exactly within the time frame that Jesus gave. And remember, Jesus said all those other events, like wars and rumors of wars, famine, and the Great Tribulation, would all happen prior to the destruction of the temple. In fact, right after listing those precursors, Jesus said in verse 24 to 26, "But in those days, after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds with power and great glory." End quote. Now, a lot of people get hung up on this apocalyptic language, like when Jesus said the sun, moon, and stars will lose their light and will fall. And when Jesus said that they would see the Son of Man coming on clouds. A lot of people think this is describing the end of the world, but it's not. Jesus is using typical Hebraic judgment language to describe the judgment of the temple or the destruction of the temple. We can be 100% sure of this because the exact same kind of apocalyptic language was used all through the Old Testament to describe previous judgments of God. For example, in Isaiah 19:1, it mentions the Lord riding a swift cloud into Egypt. This is the exact same kind of cloud coming language that Jesus used in the Olivet Discourse. But the cloud coming described by Isaiah is referring to the judgment of Egypt, which happened in approximately 700 BC. In another Old Testament prophecy, this time about the judgment of Babylon, Isaiah said, quote, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with great wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy the sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine." End quote. This is Isaiah 13, verse 9 to 13. Once again, this is the exact same kind of sun, moon, stars language that Jesus used in the Olivet Discourse. But Isaiah was describing the judgment of Babylon, which happened in the year 689 BC. So this kind of apocalyptic language was used, all through the Old Testament to describe previous judgments of God. It's typical Hebraic judgment language. It was meant no more literally than when we say it's raining cats and dogs. By the way, I have an entire video about apocalyptic language called "What is a Coming of the Lord?" I'll leave a link to that video in the video notes below if you're interested. But as I show in that video, this kind of apocalyptic language is typical Hebraic judgment language. It was used all through the Old Testament, so we don't have to guess as to what it's referring to. So when Jesus said that after the tribulation, the sun, moon, and stars will lose their light and fall from heaven, and they would see the Son of Man coming on clouds, Jesus was referring to the destruction of the temple, which all historians agree happened in the year AD 70. And remember, Jesus said the Great Tribulation would precede this event. So the Great Tribulation had to happen prior to the year AD 70. Okay, so that's my first point. My second point is this. By the time John wrote Revelation, the book of Revelation, in approximately the year 8067, or 8065 to 87, somewhere around there, 8065 to 8067, the tribulation that Jesus had prophesied about in the Olivet Discourse had already begun. Here are John's exact words in the book of Revelation. Quote, "I, John, your brother and companion in the tribulation and kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was on the island of Patmos for the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is Revelation 1, verse 9. So John said that the tribulation had already begun when he wrote the book of Revelation in approximately the year 8065 or 8067. And then John goes on to describe the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in chapter 11, verse 1 to 2, just like Jesus prophesied in the Olivet Discourse. And when did John say this event would happen? Soon, for the time is near. In fact, John opened and closed the book of Revelation by specifically saying that the events he was describing would happen soon, for the time is near. Here are John's exact words in Revelation 1, verse 1 to 3. "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to show his servants things which must shortly take place. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things that are written in it, for the time is near." So John said the events of Revelation would happen soon, for the time is near. And just so nobody can possibly miss this time indicator, John repeats this exact same thing in the last chapter of Revelation, in chapter 22, verse 6 to 10. Here's what John said. Then he said to me, "These words are faithful and true, and the Lord God of the holy prophets sent his angel to show his servants the things which must shortly take place. Behold, I am coming quickly." This is Jesus talking, by the way. He's talking about his cloud coming here. "Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." This is Revelation 22, verse 6 to 10. So just like in the Olivet Discourse, the book of Revelation mentions the destruction of the temple and says it would happen soon, for the time is near. And as I already pointed out, Revelation also describes Jesus's coming, his cloud coming. In fact, Jesus says 3 times in this chapter that he is coming quickly. And we know this is referring to Jesus' cloud coming because John said in chapter 1, verse 7, he specifically called this coming a cloud coming. So this is the same cloud coming Jesus was talking about in the Olivet Discourse. So both the Olivet Discourse and Revelation mention the same events. Both prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Both mention Jesus' cloud coming, and both give the exact same timing indicator. In Jesus' day, in the year AD 30, this event was still 40 years away. So Jesus said it would happen within a generation. But by the time Revelation was written, 35 years later, John said it was going to happen soon, for the time is near. So this timing fits perfectly. It was on the verge of happening when Revelation was written. Oh, and don't forget that John also said in Revelation that the tribulation had already begun. This is the same tribulation Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse, and it had already begun. So I think this is really good scriptural evidence that the tribulation that Jesus prophesied about in the Olivet Discourse happened in the 1st century, just prior to the destruction of the temple. My third point is this. The 1st century historian Josephus documented the Great Tribulation as it was actually happening. And keep in mind, Josephus was not only alive when this event happened, he also lived in the area. Josephus was actually a Jewish priest who fought alongside his fellow Jews against the Romans in the Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70. Eventually he was captured, and then he switched sides over to the Romans. And then after that, he wrote a historical account of the war. So Josephus witnessed and documented the events that Jesus and Revelation described, specifically the Great Tribulation. In Josephus's book called The War of the Jews, Josephus specifically mentions the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. He said 1.2 million Jews were killed, another 97,000 were taken into slavery. And he also described the tribulation. Here are a couple quotes about the tribulation by Josephus. In the first, he said, "It is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world." It sounds an awful lot like Jesus saying it would be the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be. Here's another quote from Josephus. He said, "It appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world are not so considerable as those of the Jews. This makes it impossible for me to contain my lamentations." Once again, this sounds eerily similar to Jesus saying it would be the worst tribulation that ever was or ever will be. And remember how Jesus talked about famine in the Olivet Discourse? Well, Josephus documents this too. The first quote I'm going to read is about a mother who was so hungry that she cooked and ate her own baby. Here's how Josephus described this. "A lady of rank and fortune, Mary, the daughter of Eleazar, had been obliged to take refuge in Jerusalem." And she took refuge in Jerusalem just before the Romans attacked it. Then Josephus goes on to say that the insurgents had stripped her house of every article of food and left her infant child to starve. As the armed brigades passed by her door, they inhaled the fumes from her kitchen and rushed into the house and threatened death unless the savory viands, or the food source, were disclosed. She led them inside and showed them to her horror the remains of her child. Maddened by the cravings of nature, she had murdered the infant at her breast and cooked it for food. End quote. So this is the famine that Jesus described in the Olivet Discourse. In another quote by Josephus, he said that the Jews that were inside the city of Jerusalem were so hungry that they gnawed their leather hides from their belts and shoes and shields to relieve their pangs of hunger. One more quote from Josephus about this famine. He said, "The besieged staggered about from weakness like drunken men, and their senses being unhinged and their memory gone, they would break into the same house 2 or 3 times in the same day in search of food, unconscious that they had paid the like visit before." So they would break into a house 2 or 3 times. They were so hungry and, staggering about by weakness that they didn't even know they had just broken into the house that same day. So this was the Great Tribulation that Jesus prophesied about, and it happened during the Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70. Now, some people ask, why did the Great Tribulation happen? And Jesus answers this question in the parable of the wicked vine dressers in Matthew 21, verses 33 to 45. Jesus said that God was punishing the Jews for their long history of killing the prophets. All the prophets God had sent them over the years. And of course, they also killed their very own Messiah, God's Son. Technically, it was the Romans who crucified Jesus, but the Romans did it at the behest of the Jews. And you can read about this in Matthew 25, verse 15 to 27. Or, I'm sorry, verse 15 to 25. So this was the reason for the Great Tribulation and the judgment in AD 70. God was paying back the Jews for rejecting the prophets that he had sent them and eventually killing their Messiah and persecuting, Jesus' disciples. Okay, so one more passage about the Great Tribulation I want to talk about is Daniel 12. This was actually the passage that Jesus was quoting from in the Olivet Discourse when he talked about the Great Tribulation. Remember how Jesus said it would be the greatest tribulation that ever was, ever will be. He got this from Daniel 12, which is a prophecy about the same event that Daniel had given 600 years earlier. Daniel said that this would be, quote, a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation. This is Daniel 12, verse 1. So this is the same description that Jesus gave in the Olivet Discourse. And the reason Jesus was quoting from it was because it was finally about to happen within a generation. Both Daniel and Jesus not only talk about the Great Tribulation, but they also mention the time of the end or end of the age. And you can compare Daniel 12, verse 4 and verse 9 to Matthew 24, verse 3. By the way, this reference to the end of the age, it's not referring to the end of the world. It's referring to the end of the Old Covenant age. And I have a video about this too. If you're interested, I'll leave a link to that too in the video notes below. But when Daniel and when Jesus talked about the end of the age, they're referring to the end of the Old Covenant age, not the end of the world. So both Daniel and Jesus not only talked about the Great Tribulation, but they also talked about the end of the age. They also talked about the end of sacrifices or the destruction of the temple. You can compare Daniel 12, verse 11 to Matthew 24, verse 1 to 2. They also mention the abomination of desolation. You can compare Daniel 12, verse 11 to Matthew 24, verse 15. In fact, right after Jesus mentioned the abomination, he specifically added, as spoken by Daniel. You can read this in Matthew 24, verse 15. So Jesus obviously got this prophecy from Daniel. And the reason Jesus quoted this passage is because it was finally going to be fulfilled within a generation. Here's something else that's really interesting. Daniel described this judgment as lasting, quote, a time, times, and half a time. You can read this in Daniel 12, verse 7. Most commentators say this refers to a 3.5-year period. a time refers to 1 year, times refers to 2 years, and half a time refers to half a year. So when Daniel said it would be a time, times, and half a times, he's referring to a length of 3.5 years. Now, how long did the first Jewish-Roman war last? Exactly 3.5 years. It began in the spring of AD 67 with the Jewish revolt, and it culminated in September AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So this timing of the Great Tribulation that Daniel gave, time, times, and half a time, matches perfectly with the 3.5 year Roman-Jewish war that happened in the first century. So this too is excellent evidence that the Great Tribulation happened in the first century. So the historical and the scriptural evidence for all this, for the Great Tribulation already happening, is just overwhelming. I mean, it's not just one passage. It's a series of passages. It's historical evidence, and you know, they're all pointing in the same direction. The Great Tribulation happened in the first century. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention. As I already said, despite all the evidence, some Christians believe that the Great Tribulation has still not happened. So I want to point out a few significant problems with this view, besides what I've already just, mentioned. The first problem is this: if the Great Tribulation has not happened yet, then that means that 2/3 of the Jews living in Israel will one day be slaughtered in the greatest tribulation ever. The reason I say this is because Zechariah 13 verse 8, which is another description of the Great Tribulation, Zechariah says that 2/3 of the Jews will be wiped out in this Great Tribulation. In fact, dispensationalists like Calvary Chapel pastors who believe the Great Tribulation is, still in our future, they have no problem about, saying that 2/3 of the Jews will be wiped out in the Great Tribulation. In a discussion between Sid Roth, host of the Messianic Vision, and Pat Robertson, host of 700 Club, at least they were. I think they might have both passed away by now. I think Pat Robertson has. Anyway, they said in a discussion that, actually it was Sid Roth who said this. He said, quote, 2/3 of the Jewish people living in Israel will one day be exterminated during the future Great Tribulation, end quote. Sid Roth, of course, bases on Zechariah 13 verse 8. By the way, I got this quote from Gary DeMar in his debate with Michael Brown on the future of Israel. Okay, so here's another quote by a prominent American televangelist. This is from Jack Van Impe, the late Jack Van Impe, who, this guy had a huge TV and radio ministry. He wrote in his book, Israel's Final Holocaust, quote, when the prophecy clock starts ticking again after the rapture, it will be traumatic days for Israel. Just when peace seems to have come, it will be taken from her, and she will be plunged into another bloody persecution, a devastating explosion of persecution and misery for Israel, end quote. This quote also is from Gary DeMar in that same debate with Michael Brown. Here's one more quote. This is from Pastor Rick Piatlik. I think I'm pronouncing that right, maybe not. Anyway, it's from his book, Blow the Trumpet in Zion. And he says, quote, the Bible says that this will be a time of suffering such as the world has never known. The Antichrist will kill 2/3 of the Jews. This could mean up to 10 million Jews could be killed, end quote. One more quote I want to give. This is from the notable dispensationalist theologian Charles Ryrie from his book, The Best Is Yet to Come, an ironic title, by the way, given what he says. By the way, this quote too is from Gary DeMar in that same debate with Michael Brown. And here's what Charles Ryrie said. Israel will undergo the worst bloodbath in Jewish history. Israel is destined to have a particular time of suffering which will eclipse anything that it has known in the past. By returning to Palestine, the people of Israel are placing themselves within the vortex of this future whirlwind, which will destroy the majority of those living within the land of Palestine, end quote. So dispensationalists are not shy about, talking about the Great Tribulation and saying that 2/3 of the Jews will be wiped out. And if the Great Tribulation has not happened yet, if dispensationalists are right, this is Israel's future. Thankfully, though, we can be sure that dispensationalists are not right about this for the reasons I just gave, not the least of which Jesus said that it would happen within his generation. And you can, again, read this in Matthew 24, verse 21 to 34. Keep in mind also that Jesus said in the parable of the wicked vine dressers in Matthew 21 that the reason for this judgment was because of Israel's long history of killing the prophets and killing the Messiah. But Jews today have absolutely nothing to do with that, any of that. Those Jews who killed Jesus and the prophets died off long ago. It's true that Jews today as a whole reject Christ, but so do the Chinese as a whole, and so do the Iranians as a whole, and Palestinians as a whole, many other countries as a whole. Jews today are no more responsible for killing Jesus and the prophets than anybody else. So why would God single them out, in this judgment? Moreover, the Bible specifically teaches that a son will not bear the iniquity of his father. You can read this in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, which means God would not punish today's Jews for their father's sins. Furthermore, God already has punished these Jews in AD 70, which I just described in detail. So why would he do it again? That would make no sense. Here's something else to consider too. If the Great Tribulation is really going to happen someday soon, as dispensationalists are constantly warning, one would think these dispensationalists would be trying to get Jews out of Israel. After all, the Bible says 2/3 of them will be killed. Yet, ironically, dispensationalists are doing the exact opposite. They're actually encouraging and even financially supporting Jews to go back to Israel. In fact, the dispensationalists, aka the Christian Zionists, were instrumental in the reestablishment of the nation of Israel in 1948. Their political clout and financial support made it all possible, and they've been working feverishly ever since to try to get as many Jews back into the land of Israel, in which, according to their own theology, 2/3 of them will be slaughtered in the greatest tribulation ever. Talk about irony. Now, I'm not suggesting that dispensationalists want harm to come to the Jews. They obviously don't. But that's the logical conclusion of their actions if their theology is correct. Some Jews have even picked up on this, by the way. Here's something interesting, too, that during an interview on the floor of the 2012 Democratic National Convention, a Jewish attendee commented, quote, "Christians just want us, the Jews, to be there in Israel so that we can be slaughtered and converted and bring on the second coming of Jesus Christ. The worst possible allies of the Jewish state are the fundamentalist Christians. It's a false friendship. They are seeking their own ends, not ours," end quote. This guy's logic makes perfect sense. If the Great Tribulation is coming soon to Israel, right, or on Israel, as dispensationalists like Jack Hibbs and Greg Laurie and Amar Tarfati constantly tell us, then these guys should be imploring Jews to leave Israel. Yet they are doing the exact opposite, which has given Christianity a bad name in the eyes of many Jews. Bad theology has bad real-world ramifications. Speaking of bad theology has bad real-world ramifications, how sad it is that so many Christians in Nazi Germany took a hands-off approach during the Holocaust. One wonders how this could have happened, how so many Christians can sit back and essentially do nothing as Jews burned in the ovens of Auschwitz. How could this have happened? Some have suggested that it was because too many Christians living in that day mistakenly believed that the Holocaust that was happening in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. After all, Jesus said the greatest tribulation ever was coming on Jews, so maybe this Holocaust was it. And attempting to stop this Holocaust was seen by many Christians as opposing God. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting this was the case with all Christians. Many Christians, in that time period did everything they could to save Jews, even at great risk to themselves and their families. Unfortunately, though, many did not because of bad theology. At least many have, opined that that's why it happened. So bad theology has bad real-world ramifications. Now, imagine if Jews start to get persecuted again, you know, just like in the Holocaust. Are dispensationalists going to sit back again and go, well, this could be the Great Tribulation. You know, we don't want to get involved because maybe this is God's will. This is the problem with bad theology. It leads to bad real-world implications. So it's important we get this right. This isn't just a theological, you know, issue. It has real-world implications, and it's important that we get it right. And as I've shown, the biblical and historical evidence overwhelmingly shows that the Great Tribulation already happened. Thank God. So instead of running around warning people about some soon coming Great Tribulation, Christians should instead be, you know, teaching other Christians to build up the kingdom of God, expand the kingdom of God, and make this world a better place to live. After all, we're God's hands and feet in this world. That's what we should be doing. Improving the world, bettering the world, making this a better place to live. That's the Christian's mission today, not warning about some judgment that already happened. Okay, so that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do me a huge favor, hit the like button. Also, if you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. And for a more detailed discussion of the topics I've talked about in this video, get my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. I go into much more detail about these issues that I brought up in this video. I also talk about a bunch of other kinds of end times related topics, such as who is Israel today, and the passing of heaven and earth, and the infamous mark of the beast that's talked about in Revelation. In fact, I have an entire chapter devoted to the book of Revelation. So if you're interested in eschatology or end time stuff, or if you know somebody who is, get my book. It's available on Amazon. I also have a bunch of free articles and videos on my website, thebiblefulfilled.com, so you can check that out too if you're interested. Again, it's thebiblefulfilled.com. Okay, so thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time.